Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Jody Hobbs Hesler.
Hi there. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited to be chatting with you today, all about your writing and your books. So, can you tell me a little bit about what you write?
Sure. And thanks so much for having me. Usually when people ask what I write about, I say sad families because it's fast. And it's also true. But it also harkens to Tolstoy's happy families are all alike and unhappy families are different after their own fashion. That idea that there's more to write about in our unhappiness than in our happiness. Though I have to say, I do love a writer every now and then who throws in a story that's all about joy and makes the tension work anyway. That I have a lot of respect for that. But most specifically, I work with characters who are usually struggling over some kind of connection in their lives. So that seems to be where I go with my stories.
That is so interesting. Yeah, so what just pitch your short story collection that you just released, and I read that you also have an upcoming novel, so if you want to plug that a little too.
Yeah. So the stories, it's a collection called What Makes You Think You're Supposed to Feel Better. And there are 17 stories all set in and around Central Virginia, where I live. The characters are all struggling over some different kinds of connections. Some of them are over long lost love. Some of them are over regrets that they have. Some of them are trying to connect as parents with their children. Some of them are children being sort of isolated from the world of their parents and sort of struggling to find purchase there. So it's all about connection and all sort of located here. The characters vary in socioeconomic status, age, gender. So the stories are quite different, and the kind of voice that's used in the stories varies a lot too.
That is so cool.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, actually, I'd love to talk a little bit about voice, especially when writing a short story collection. Like, how do you differentiate between each of the characters' voices, and how do you hear that?
Well, it's a good question. The stories happen one at a time, and so in a way, and so does a novel. I might work on all of these things at the same time, but they're still individual entities. So when I'm working on a story that has a very specific voice, when I'm in that story, I'm in that voice. I don't leave it. So that's kind of how I work with a bunch of different ones. So the voice of Mavis Bouchard in regular English is never ever going to be the same as Otto in The Secret Life of Otto and Hilda. They're so unlike in so many ways that I wouldn't get them mixed up. And the pattern of the way the story comes out matches who it's about. So I think that's a way to put it.
That's really cool. Yeah. I'm still thinking about what you were saying about how you write about like sad families. And can we talk a little bit about the role of family in your writing and how that comes across?
It's a good question. The role of family. I'm thinking about in Grown Up Party, which is the last story, there's a little girl who's with her father for his custodial weekend, and he's dragging her and her big brother to some party for grown-ups that's absolutely no place for children. So family in that scenario is sort of an unsafe place. That may be a little bit. I think I like for surprising things to like the fact that a family would be an unsafe place is not the first thought. Usually, even if we come from troubled families, it's usually not the first thought we have when we think the word family. So I like sort of knocking on that door, sort of upsetting what our expectation might be for a character. So family is a way to do that. We might rely on family, or we might, but by the same token, in Harmony, there's a couple waiting for their adult daughter to arrive for a dinner, and they're disappointed because she's in town but not staying with them. And there's a rupture in the family between the parents and the child, but the parents still have a connection. So playing with connection, I guess because I'm so interested in connection for characters, that's the go-to place for me. Family is a place where that shows up the most, where it's sort of heightened within families and marriages and things like that, where the bonds are kind of certified by some external source, where it's obvious when there's a rupture that it shouldn't be there. So I think that's
I love that so much because like when writing about a friendship or something like that, where it's not a family relationship necessarily in the traditional sense, you don't really know because it looks different for everyone. So when you're reading that story, it's not as set. You don't have as many set expectations. But when you're
right.
hearing a story about parents and a child, you have everyone has their own preconceived notions about this is what this looks like. And
Right.
that's you can really divert expectations there.
Right. And it's clear pretty much right away for a reader what the stakes are if that relationship is troubled, that the stakes are high. For a kid not being able to trust their parent, or for someone foundering in a marriage relationship or something, it's clear that there's something at stake even before we get to know the character better.
So what does your character creation process look like? Do you start you mentioned that you're really interested in their connections. Do you start with the connection or do you start with the person?
It varies by story. It's interesting. I've been creating these little short video reels for Instagram that are telling stories behind the story for the stories in the collection. And there's usually some real thing that happened that sets off the idea, whether it's never, this happened and here's the story about it, but it's, these things happen and you'd never know that's how this character came into existence. So it varies quite a bit. Sometimes I get sort of the voice of the character just sort of talking to me, and I kind of start writing and follow where they go and find the story that way and find the character that way. And sometimes it's more of a, like with Harmony, the story where the couple is waiting for their daughter to meet them at a restaurant. Uh, we have really nice restaurants here in Charlottesville, Virginia. We have excellent foodie status here. So there's fine dining and all of the accoutrement and the service staff that goes with it. And through people we know who are in the industry, jobs our kids had, we've sort of seen the hospitality industry from every angle. And at some point I became curious, what would it mean if someone mistook the genuine hospitality of a really good restaurant and or a server at a really good restaurant, they mistook that for actual intimacy? What would that look like, and what would that require? So that's how those characters kind of came into being, was exploring that set of questions, like what would they need in order for that to be true, and what would need to be happening to make that enough of a conflict to pull the rest of the story through.
That is so interesting because I feel like we've all either been someone or been around someone who's kind of left feeling like the server was their friend or
Yeah,
had something like that where it's because there's that fine line where it's like this is a performance of this
right,
hospitality and like this is their job and everything, but sometimes people can be like, "Oh no, we're actually close now."
right.
After what that happened. So that's something really interesting to explore.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's something that I became especially interested in after having sort of the insider view of everything, because it's true. People who are in that industry, it's not incidental that they want you to feel welcome. It's not inauthentic. It's just not intimate. So
Yes.
so there's a lot of cues that a person could follow in order to be mistaken on that front, so because it is genuine, this genuine desire to share a special experience with people. That's what a really good hospitality industry is all about. So I found it really fun to explore that one.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating. So, how did you get the idea to write these stories and have them all be interconnected by this town?
Well, I decided a long time ago that I would write my stories in real places. And there is one story that happens closer to northwestern Virginia, because that's a place I've spent a lot of time as well. So, but when I choose a real place, I have a very concrete idea of what it is. So when I describe it, my description obeys that and is more consistent internally. So someone who's never been where I'm describing will understand it because the streets are always going to connect where they're supposed to connect, if you know what I mean.
Mhm.
Another thing I do when I'm writing a novel, I will draw the terrible at this, but I will draw the house where the main action takes place. Like, so the main characters live here. So that when they walk in the front door, they're always walking into the same orientation of a room to cut down the chance that I might describe it differently in two different places in the book and utterly confuse my reader because it's something we don't really know we're paying attention to. So by that same logic, I decided to start writing things where I am so that they follow the rules. I do break the rules. I do change how streets go, but I know what I'm doing when I'm doing it. So I create some play with it, for different reasons and different stories. But the hope is that it then feels familiar, that the reader feels sort of like they've visited the area, like they get an idea of what it feels like to be here.
And I'm sure that it's nice for people that are also local, and then they can read it and say, like, oh, yeah, wait, I know that street.
Right.
That's an actual thing. And they obviously cared for the
Yeah.
details.
Well, and I'm
I,
sure that I'm sure I'll get some people that will correct me on the things that I have shifted in order to make other things possible in the story. So, I'll have to say creative license, but
well, that's always the case. You could say, I've lived here my entire life. I know every street, and someone's gonna be like, actually, there's one letter that's different in that street sign.
exactly.
I think that's interesting that you draw the house because that's something that can be so personal is like where you live, the way that you live, who you're with, who you live with. Like that's so many factors there. Do you also draw your characters or any other part of the story?
No, and it's probably good that I don't, because again, I'm not good at it. If we tried to translate my little house plans into actual architectural plans, they would not work. But they're enough for me to make sense. Another thing to do, that I know writers who go on, like Zillow, and look at different houses so they can pick a house that belongs to their character, and then they'll go through all the rooms and they'll remember it that way. And I think that's pretty clever. I think the idea is having something concrete so that you're less likely to make mistakes that the reader will not realize they're catching you on, and just flounder with.
Yeah, I think that is so interesting. I always get kind of caught up on that when I'm trying to write a story because I'm like, no, that's their house. That's not these characters don't live there. That's someone else's house. My
Right.
characters have their own place,
Right.
even though it's somewhere that needs someone to live. And of course, other people have lived in every house or whatever. But I always get stuck on that step. So, do you have a favorite piece of writing advice that you've received?
Um, I have a couple of favorite pieces of writing advice, and one of them, was delivered as a part of a craft talk at a conference that I went to, and it was Jill McCorkle, and she said, "Never underestimate your subconscious." And I thought that was a great piece of advice because so often when we spill out our first draft, there's a lot that has to go. There's a lot of just garbage. We have to root it out, but we can accidentally root out the good stuff because our subconscious was doing something. There's so many layers to how we process a story. So that spoke to me a lot. And another one was, this was in a workshop at a conference, and Tim O'Brien said, "Don't be afraid of sentiment, be afraid of fraudulence." And I liked that because a lot of people want to discourage you from discourage writers from writing about emotional moments. Just keep it spare, kind of, but a lot of admonitions about how to handle emotion. And I think it's important to accept that, yeah, we're going to hold this emotion and it's going to be a hot potato. And in order to do that, we have to make sure we do service to what it is. So if this is a really, really difficult emotion, then we have a lot of work to do to make it authentic. So authenticity versus avoiding it sounded like a better path.
I love that. What are some things that you do in your writing to try and maintain that authenticity?
So many things. Sometimes it's reading things out loud. Sometimes when I'm working on a scene over and over again, trying to get the emotion right, and then I read it out loud and I go, oh my goodness, I have rung that bell too many times. It's way overdone. So like a really strong emotion needs simple description. It needs to be, it doesn't need a lot of context. We usually, as humans, recognize what big, difficult emotions are. So we don't need to say it felt like that, like the sky was falling. We don't need to go into that territory. We need to show the character and show exactly how they're experiencing it. And usually picking something that isn't typical. So another thing that this reminds me of is I wrote a craft essay a while back that was kind of creating a glossary of sort of made up terms to help talk about workshop writing, so there's one thing that I call cliches of the body. And this is I trying to get rid of cliches of the body is one way that I try to maintain authenticity. And some of those things are like, we say the character smiled, we say the character rolled their eyes, we say the character's stomach rolled. And all of those things are things that happen, they're real. But if the only emotional indicator we have in a scene is that they smiled, that could mean 7 million things. People can smile snarkily, they can smile with interest, they can smile with pathos, they can smile because they're not really paying attention. So that's a thing to root out. When we're writing a scene the first time, we might throw those things in there because we know those things, and they're placeholders for something deeper and more layered. So that's looking for those and trying to make sure that I haven't shortcutted the reader and the character on what they're experiencing is a way to tidy it up and try to stick with the authentic.
I love that. And because there is so much behind a smile. And when every writer will translate that differently, like what everyone has a different way that their smiles or whatever present. So it's like, oh, to me, this body language means this a 100%, but to my readers, it may not.
Right. And we usually, when we do just that, when we have only one of those little bodily indicators and not the rest of the emotional thing we're trying to establish, we know exactly where we're going with it, and we just haven't brought the reader there. So to me, they're flags for, have I brought the reader here? It doesn't mean you can never smile. Like, it doesn't mean our characters we can't talk about their lips, like we can. They do smile, but they don't, if that's all they're doing, if that's the only indicator, we likely haven't set the pattern for the reader to follow.
Absolutely. So when did you start writing?
I've basically been writing since I was a little kid. And I remember like scribble drawing books in the backseat of long car rides and stapling them together and reading them to my grandmother, reading them, there were no words, and then reading them over again with new words. So still learning what words were. So, but I remember doing that from early on, and it's kind of strange. I just didn't stop doing it. So it's not like I've been writing as a complete full-time gig, like for my whole life, but it's something that's always been there for me, something that has always been part of how I thought of myself.
Yeah, that is so cool. That's awesome. So wait, so when did it become a full-time gig for you?
I mean, basically, I stayed home with my kids when they're adults now, they're fully fledged. But the idea was that as I gained more time, as they got a little older and became more independent, I would continue to use more and more of that time for my writing. And I have stayed home after they have left home. So I'm still doing it. That said, because I'm not doing it through like the more typical channels of like the academic world or whatever other things, and I'm not a like a best-selling author where that's actually paying a large number of bills.
Yes.
So there's a lot of flex in between. But that means I do other things too. I like to do book reviews for other writers, particularly debut writers with small presses, and especially if they're underrepresented voices. That's kind of what I like to review. And for me, for a long time, before I knew that a book would actually finally come out in the world, what I knew is that I could contribute something and I could be part of a conversation, even if it wasn't for me. And that was meaningful for me. And it also keeps me busy. I've been saying no to some reviews while my book is in the middle of coming out because I don't quite have the time for it. But I also write and edit for some regional interest magazines in town. These are small gigs. The way I talk about it is it's like I'm juggling 1,000 marbles. So each of the
Yeah.
marbles is a distinct thing, and none of them are huge. So if I drop them, no one else knows, but I'll spend the rest of the day trying to find it, with keeping 999 other ones in the air. So that's that's kind of how it feels. So I do a lot of writing, and I also call it writing adjacent things. So like I teach at a writing center here in town, which is very lovely group of people. It's called WriterHouse. And what I love is it's everybody who just wants to be there. They're short periods. So I teach like 6 or 8 sessions, and then I can have a little bit of a break and go back to it. So you can do as much or as little, pretty much as you, and I don't mean as little, but you can keep them separated so that I can sit down and have large breaks where I'm mostly just working on my own writing. So
That is awesome. Yeah, I was actually going to say I love that you're able to do all the things, but still have it relate back to your writing, even though you have so many other gigs and so many other things that you're focusing on. You're able to kind of like still have that. Because I know sometimes that can be really hard for creative people to find other things in this niche.
yeah. And I've been building them slowly. So then all of a sudden there's a lot. so it, which I love, but it's also funny because I'll be so busy sometimes thinking that I deliberately don't have a traditional job so that I have time to do this thing that now, because I'm doing these adjacent things, I don't have time to do.
You know
So
what? I am the same exact way. I completely understand. Yeah. So, what are some of the differences for you in writing short stories versus writing long form?
that's a good question. I consider writing different lengths sort of like cross training for writers. The short story form really asks you to distill, so it's a question of what we leave out and still maintain a feeling of a whole. And with a book, you have to put a lot more in, but then the focus becomes on how do you channel what you put in there, so you're putting in relevant ingredients and not just extra scenes. They have to be important, so they have to have sort of that the same level of distilled importance that the short story does, but stretched out over a long time. So it's marathon versus a sprint in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I can totally see that. So, what interested you in making this piece specifically short fiction?
In the collection.
The collection, I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I had a number of stories floating around, and I had put them together in different formulations over the last while, in trying to find a good combination that would really feel like a book. And I put some of the iterations that I worked on had 10 stories. Some of them had 14. This one has 17. I didn't expect the one with the most stories in it to be the one that worked, but it did for me, and it luckily worked for Cornerstone Press too. So I've wanted to have a book in the world. I've been working on novels as well and have one coming out. It just felt like the time to put them together and make it an entity. It's interesting because I've been publishing stories here and there, over the course of many, many years. and putting them together, it feels different. The having the physical object of the book and people understanding that, okay, this random story here and that random story there, they're not random. And there's a unity to the work that I'm doing. There's something about that that's been really satisfying for having
Yeah.
them in the book.
When did that moment first kind of happen for you when it was like, I have a book. I wrote a book. It is a full book. I have it in my hand. Was it when you received the printing or the publisher or what?
Right. I mean, I've put together, this is the thing that's so interesting. I had these two, the novel and the story collection, get accepted within about 3 months of each other after shopping both of them around for quite a while.
That's
And before
incredible.
that, thank you. And before that, I had the novel that's going to be published. I had written many complete drafts of. I had sent it to agents and publishers many different times, and then finally got to the point where I felt like that one was done. And similarly, I'd been working with different shapes of the story collection. So when did it finally feel like I'd written a book? It felt like I'd written a book about 20 times during that process, which is really interesting that after you do it the first time, I remember that the first book I wrote and rewrote and really kind of devoted myself to finalizing as a book that never published. But my kids were really little when it happened. And that one, I remember when I got to the end, it just hit me out of nowhere that if I had done something else with my life, I wouldn't have written the book. Like I wouldn't be sitting here thinking, I just wrote a book. So maybe I'd be this was never an interest of mine, but in the moment, this is what came to me. It's like, maybe I'd be a brain surgeon, but I'd still be sitting there thinking, I wish I'd written that book, because that's what I'd always wanted to do. So getting to the end of that one was that sort of culminating moment. That the rest is sort of like, oh yeah, this happens. And then you wait. And then there's these other waiting
Yeah.
rooms you have to wait through. And then there's this other process. So it can be anticlimactic as well, but there is satisfaction when you get through that first iteration of a thing and really know you've put the work in and made something unique.
It's beautiful. Yeah, I love asking that question because it is so different for everyone because of the waiting times and the amount of rewrites and it's like when do you actually feel like you have this finished product?
Exactly. And it's so many times. So many
Yeah.
times.
Yeah, I was gonna actually ask you, do you write your stories chronologically? Like this could be for your novel. Did you write that chronologically? Do you write the short stories in the order they appeared in the book? Just
Right. So the stories in the book absolutely are not chronological. I ordered them. That was a project that took many different efforts, figuring out where the rhythm of the stories would be. In the end, what I did that helped a lot was write all the story titles down with the first and last lines of each story, and then cut them out and shuffle them around on the table. And what I'm looking for when I'm doing that is, like I said, I have a variety of characters and voices. So I don't want two absolutely similar ones right beside each other, because they maybe feel like one story instead of two if you're reading them through. So I want, like in a music mix, you want the moment of a budding to be different enough that it's not jarring, but similar enough that you can make the transition smoothly. So that's what I was looking for, is all the places where they might meet. And I was happy with how it ended in the end of that process. For the novel, that's a more complicated question than you would realize, because that is a story that's told. There is a present arc in the novel, but there is a tragedy that happens in the childhood of one of the main characters, and you constantly circle back to it. So there's flashbacks through there that are more complicated than flashbacks. It's more like that person's experience is just juxtaposed with in the past with the present, to keep the reader aware of how much pressure the past puts on the present when there's a trauma in someone's life, the way it plays out. So when I originally wrote that book, I wrote it in chronological order, but it lost some of the tension because the traumatic event was way back here and the book ends way over here. And I knew I didn't want to move the traumatic event because that would change the story completely. So I had to move the working parts of the novel. And that took a lot of time and effort and all sorts of different little cutout things moving around tables to try to see where everything fit. So.
Yeah, that, I mean, really bringing it back to your point, though, about how it's like a sprint versus a marathon.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I've had an incredible time interviewing you today. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I just have one last question, and that's, what do you have coming up?
Well, I have a bunch of different events with the story collection that I'm looking forward to, some readings and other events like that. And then the novel will come out next year. We're looking at fall of 2024. It's called Without You Here, and that's with Flexible Press out of Minnesota. And then I'm working on another novel that I'm hoping I'll have revised and ready to shop around pretty soon, and several stories in different stages of readiness. So always staying busy. One of the things about doing short and long form at the same time is I always have something to work on when I sit down.
That is all incredible. Everyone, please go buy the short story collection and any future books and projects and all of the incredible things you have coming up. For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
And I'm Jody Hobbs Hesler.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after.
The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.